And good morning, everyone. And we're all very excited to be here. We have Amy Harmon, multiple Pulitzer Prize winner from the New York Times. We have Margaret Mellon from the Union of Concerned Scientists. We have Phil Miller in charge of regulatory affairs for Monsanto, and Greg Jaffe in charge of biotech at Center for Science and the Public Interest. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk on a topic that no one really knows what they feel about, right? None of you has an opinion on GMOs. It's one of those, everyone's so wishy-washy, so we're going to help you make up your mind today. What we really hope you'll do is keep an open mind. No matter what you've come in thinking, I have no idea if you'll change your mind. None of us has any ideas, but I hope we're going to be getting some new information that can help us understand the nuance and take a more informed position, because that's what feeding the planet can do, and that's what we're all gathered here to do. And no one better to lead with than Amy Harmon, a longtime science reporter and Pulitzer Prize winner. Everybody always gets that in once it's forever attached to the name once it starts. Whose pieces in the New York Times this year you have all read. In July, A Race to Save the Orange by Altering Its DNA, and then Golden Rice, A Lifesaver. They were very eye-opening, even for those of us who've been following these topics for a long time, because through the use of narrative, Amy made riveting a bunch of moral dilemmas and made us all, I think differently about GMOs and the food supply and what it means for both the people who grow them as well as the people who eat them. Amy, I was going to ask you what led you to this and how you changed your mind or opened your mind while you were researching.
And so this debate over GMOs has been going on for 20 years. So like a year ago when I started thinking about it, I thought, like, is there anything new to say here? And GMOs had sort of clearly become linked in the public mind to industrial agriculture, big agriculture. People did not like GMOs because they associated them with, chemicals. They associated them with Monsanto. No offense, they don't like Monsanto.
Well, that's the beginning of many Monsanto. No offense.
So I might not have written about, the other part of my job is to tell a story. So I might not have written about GMOs had I not stumbled across the story of the orange, the plight of the orange. And so I learned about this disease that was threatening the orange industry in Florida, the crop in Florida that basically provides most of the orange juice that Americans drink. We drink 1 billion gallons of orange juice a year. And it's really in jeopardy because there is a bacterial disease that originally came from China and is spread by an insect called the Asian citrus psyllid, and it is wiping out the crop in Florida. It's called citrus greening. And they've tried everything to cure this disease. They are spraying lots of pesticides to try to stop the insects that spread the disease from tree to tree. They tried biological controls, and they've looked for naturally a mutant tree that would resist the bacteria, but they can't find one. And so they have turned to trying to find a genetically modified solution. So the orange itself does not have the ability to fend off this disease, but some organism that exists might. And if they took a gene, the leading one is a spinach gene, that is able to fight off this bacteria and put it in the orange and grew an orange tree, it might be resistant to the disease.
Let's just stop and say, spinach, it's green. It's not a fruit, it's a vegetable, and they experimented with fish. So we're already getting into the territory that people start worrying about in transgenic mutation.
Yeah, so So there's this element. So in addition to like a dislike of big agriculture and of big companies, there is this sense of like, oh, that's like just kind of, it's like the ick factor. But I asked these people, it's an orange grower who's spearheading this particular effort. There are other efforts to do this. And I followed them around for a while and talked to their scientists and tried to understand what they were doing. And I really just tried to sort of lay out that case, because to me it seemed like a different kind of GMO. Like, not all GMOs are created equal. And when we think about GMOs, we think about, we think about chemicals, or we think about big, but it's just a technology. It's not a food system. And I felt like each crop should be weighed on its own merits. And so.
And we think about fish in our flavor saver tomatoes, or
Yes,
or things like that. That is what comes to mind. So that's.
Right.
Why
so,
this narrative
people would
change?
ask them, will my orange juice be green? And the scientists would have to explain, no. It's the gene that gets put into. It's the function of the gene that matters. It is not, one gene does not carry with it the identity of an entire species. Will my orange juice taste like spinach? No, it won't.
But before the reaction, some of the issues that came up in the story were the very economic survival of not only the farmer, who's a very large-scale farmer, you mentioned but also a whole state's industry.
Right. There are 70,000 jobs that are related to the orange growing in Florida. Again, we drink 1 billion gallons of it a year, so if we didn't have something to protect Florida's trees, we would probably be importing them, although this is a disease that's affecting orange trees around the world, so eventually that might not even be an option. I think it's, so it's a question of sort of costs and benefits. I came back and I wrote about another one because there was a little news thing that I learned about actually on Twitter that where golden rice, which is another genetically modified crop that's been in development for a really long time. Some protesters in the Philippines where the rice is in field trials, and they hope to introduce it sometime soon. Was ripped out. So protesters ripped down a fence and ripped up the rice plants that were growing in this field, where they were being tested for the effects on the environment. And I just sort of use that as a news peg to write about this issue of golden rice, because you could sort of say, well, okay, maybe I don't care about orange juice. Maybe I think orange juice actually is unhealthy, and I prefer.
Or Florida's too centralized in agricultural
Yes.
industry. It would be better if it returned to smallholders.
Right. So you could do with that orange juice, but what golden rice is aimed at is saving people's lives. And about 500,000 children go blind because of vitamin A deficiency in developing countries, and vitamin A deficiency weakens the immune system. So many more millions die because of a weakened immune system, of other diseases that they wouldn't otherwise die of because they lack vitamin A. And what golden rice does is it uses a gene from corn and a gene from a bacteria, and it creates beta carotene in rice. Rice is eaten by many people in the developing world only eat rice, and so it's a way of getting beta carotene to these people who eat rice. And so the protesters in the Philippines had a lot of the same concerns as activists here who oppose GMOs in general for reasons that we'll discuss. But they were worried about health concerns, they were worried about the environment, and they were particularly worried that it was going to be sort of a controlling, this is just about big companies trying to come in and control our agriculture. And what was interesting to me in this episode was that scientists around the world signed a petition. Scientists began really speaking out about it. And I think that for a long time the debate has been about just biotech people versus activists who are opposing. But I think that there's sort of mainstream scientists who might not even be they're not genetic engineers necessarily, but they're concerned that there is a lack of understanding of the sort of the facts of are these things what is the real health effect of GMOs? What is the real environmental effect of GMOs? So there was this petition that went around trying to sort of saying golden rice does not raise these concerns, and we're so to me those two crops were just interesting because they seem counterintuitive. They seem different than the typical GMO thing that you think about when you think about GMOs. So,
also, golden rice it does two things. It galvanizes the scientific community when they see the kind of destruction of one of the very few field trials that's already passed a lot of hurdles. The Philippines only allowed 4, I think, and that's it in the whole world. So if you're looking for long-term environmental impact studies, which everyone always is, they need them, what happens if there's already so much protest that activists come in and just destroy it? But also the idea that this is something that actually could benefit the public health. It seemed a very clarifying moment for these worldwide scientists, and I know that Margaret Mellon will have something to say about this. So golden rice, which is the longest experimented improved food, genetically modified food, just to improve health of everything, and it's already so slow and so long. And thank you very much. And I'm going to go over to Greg because You don't have to lead straight with golden rice. But Center for Science and the Public Interest has taken some rather brave stands because I think it's the nutritional watchdog in Washington. I hope you're all familiar with it. I won't ask for a show of hands because it should be universal. You should all be on CSPI site all the time. But they've taken a very moderate, I would say, checks and balances, good and bad stance about GMOs that has upset people on both sides because there's no one down the line way of characterizing it. But could you start with some of the, and they have, what is this called? Straight Talk about?
Straight Talk about GMOs.
Straight Talk about GMOs, which is right there downloadable on the site and is, I think, a terrific introduction to the damage it can do, the environmental and health concerns, and also the benefits. So could you summarize some of the herbicide and insecticide concerns that everyone has about tolerance? Because you bring out the good and bad in a way most people aren't able to summarize as you can.
Well, thank you, Corby. And I think I will pick up on something that Amy said, where she said not all GE is created equal. And I think that's the way we look at it at CSPI. We look at it case by case. And if there's one message I always tell to students and others, it's always challenge people about the facts and really look at this case by case. It's not a monolithic technology. It's a technology that is applied in specific instances. And when you do, you can have benefits, you can have risks, you can have a whole host of things. And so I think the debate all the time is always characterized as proponents or opponents, in some ways exaggerating all of these things. And I think you need to search down below that. And that's what we've tried to do at CSPI. And so we have looked at the current crops in the US and said that those crops are safe, food made from those crops are safe to eat. I think there are a lot of other groups that have said that. Maybe we've said it louder than others. But that was a fact-based look at things. That doesn't predict what will happen in the future. You still have to look at each one of these on a case-by-case basis as they come forward. And similarly, we've looked, as Corby said, on some of the environmental impacts of these crops. And there have been some. And we've been fairly vocal lately about the fact that, while it may be safe to grow herbicide-tolerant soybeans and herbicide-tolerant corn, you have to do it in a judicious fashion. You have to use it in a way that's integrated with a lot of the other farming techniques that farmers have had for a long time to sort of reduce the likelihood of pests getting resistant.
And can we just have a big picture reminder that between 80 and 90% of all corn and soy grown commercially in this country is genetically modified?
Right, and not only is it genetically modified, but a lot of it's genetically modified to be tolerant to the same herbicide, glyphosate. And so, no surprise that we have now, 22 states with some 15 different weed species that farmers are challenged with because using glyphosate with glyphosate-tolerant crops was easy to use, and a lot of farmers adopted it, and they made a lot of money off of it, but it may be short-sightedly, they've now led to a lot of resistant weeds, and that's forcing farmers to now go back to old tools in the toolbox. We supported the use of glyphosate, and we still do because it's a relatively benign herbicide.
That I'd forgotten, that it was more benign. That was part of the initial propaganda, the reports about the possible advantages of Roundup Ready, that it already was much less environmentally destructive. And so rolling that back because of tolerance means going to more destructive herbicides.
Right, so you have, I think that properly so, some of the biotech crops have been touted to reduce insecticide use or to lead to using more benign herbicides, but that only works if you use them in a judicious fashion, not in a misuse kind of fashion. And that's not to say that all farmers are misusing them out there, but unfortunately there has been some misuse of them, and that's led to the fact that now if you ask Midwest corn farmers, they're now spraying insecticides even though they're also using BT because they want to have an insurance that the corn rootworm doesn't cause that problem. Or farmers are forced on the Eastern Shore. When I went to visit some farmers a few weeks ago, they said that they're now forced in their herbicide-tolerant crops to also pass on their field with another herbicide afterwards to get the weeds that are out there. So these are environmental impacts now. They're not different. We've seen farming has always, over time, had resistant weeds develop and resistant pests develop.
And while you're there, you were so good on defining superweed. We all have heard the term superweed, especially in the context of Roundup Ready. But what you're talking about are just resistant weeds, and you have a different definition of superweed.
Right. I've been following the debate for a while, and I may not have it right, but my understanding of a superweed was something where the gene that was introduced into the crop under the genetic engineering then passes to either a wild relative or of that, and that becomes a super crop because that now has the gene, so it can't be, it would be resistant to the herbicide that was sprayed on that. What we're seeing here is just normal biology happening. So the weeds that are developing in the field aren't in any way species that are related to corn or related to soybean. It's not the gene is jumping into those species. It's just a natural biological process that, you know, the mutations are occurring naturally, or that one of those 1,000 weeds in that field is resistant to glyphosate, and that ends up becoming a competitive advantage. Going back to Darwin.
As opposed to a frankenweed.
That's right.
Which is what they could be called. And insecticides. Could you tell us something about BT corn and insecticides?
So again, you have to look at it case by case. Different BT corn products some have reduced insecticide use, some haven't reduced insecticide use as much as others. If you had BT cotton, you see a real large insecticide reduction. You see some insecticide reduction for BT corn, depending on whether it's rootworm or corn borer, depending on which pest you're going after. But again, you're also beginning to see in the Midwest some resistant corn rootworms to one in particular, one of the BT molecules, and again, we won't name companies or anything, in part because of the biology around that. The BT toxin that was introduced into the plant was not a high dose one, and so the scientists had warned us that we might get resistance to it, and we needed to be extra careful about it. And again, corn prices went through the roof in the Midwest, and farmers grew corn on corn on corn on corn 4 or 5 years in the same field. And any entomologist would tell you, independent of whether it was genetically engineered or not, that if you keep growing corn and using the same insecticides in that field, whether it's a genetically engineered pesticide or otherwise, you're going to put pressure for resistant pests to develop. And so
monocropping and huge, large-scale industrial farming are two of the main themes that go through any discussion of this. We're talking about specifics to do with it, but the practice of monocropping, just one crop, as opposed to the traditional rotations and diversity of many crops grown on a plot of land, that has to do with a lot of the problems we see as well. You had an interesting point about, for example, when I brought up, what's the point of even defending BT corn? Because everything is going to develop resistance. So you're going to have to use more insecticide eventually anyway. So isn't it always a case of developing tolerance, and then what comes later is worse? And you refuted that.
Well, I mean, I think the idea is we want to use all of these tools judiciously and use them when they're needed and use them in a limited fashion, in a judicious fashion, so that you can preserve them for future generations of farmers. And so I think it's not a one or the other. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the agriculture that we've had in the industrial agricultural complex in the U.S. has been sort of a use and abuse and then move on to the next technology situation. And there's always been a next technology down the road. I think if you ask scientists and companies, they don't have a lot of new insecticides down the road. And so instead, we're now in a situation where we want to judiciously use these and preserve them. And biotech in some ways may help that and may, give a slightly better environmental profile to agriculture, which has a lot of detrimental impacts on the environment by using them, but you have to then use them in an integrated fashion.
Yeah, I think what you said was, you have 5 or 6 years reprieve of using dangerous insecticides that harm the workers and the fields and the environment, and at least you're getting 5 years of reduced insecticide load.
It's better to have that, but it would be better to have 10 or 20 or 25 years.
Yeah, right, for eternity.
I mean, there are systems out there available to us that would make it possible not to use either the BT crops, which have the pesticide built into them, or pesticides that are exogenously applied. And at least from my point of view, a lot of this debate, which I agree with almost everything that's been said, is embedded in a debate about the vision of agriculture going forward, and what steps we should take today with the tools that we have in our toolbox to get us to an agriculture that is not dependent on pesticides, on too much nitrogen, that takes care of the soil. Now, we're obviously, in my view, not going in the right direction right now, but that is really one of the important things, is to make sure that we compare not biotech to, say, a BT crop to an exogenous application of a pesticide, but to a system where you wouldn't need to use either. And that system has been available to all of us for, ever since I started working on this debate, which is, in the early 80s. So I was there when all the original promises were made. But the key to that is to use the principles of agroecology, which are to rotate the crops, use adequate and well thought out tillage, use cover crops. Now, we're not doing any of those things at any level in this country, nor are we working very hard to project that kind of a vision to other parts of the world. And that, to me, is the big problem with biotech. It's not that it makes food unsafe. I think the products, right now on the market are safe, although that says nothing about the citrus greening products, but for the time being. But the big problem is that it's taking up too much space in the room, is that this panel is talking about biotechnology, which actually is taking us in the wrong direction toward more pesticides, reinforcing industrial agriculture, and not leaving any space to talk about these robust, exciting, viable technologies that are out there that are just being neglected.
So what are government policies that can encourage this and change the framework?
Well, let's start with not giving people huge subsidies to grow corn. Let's try to think about redesigning our agricultural policy, and there isn't a person in this room who couldn't do kind of a better job than the gerrymandered, thing we have right now, but that really focused on where you want to go and how you get there. If you want to go to a country where farmers can realistically rotate their crops, you need to think about how to deploy subsidies to make it possible for folks to do that. And maybe you don't give them a subsidy to grow corn 5 years in a row. You only give it to them one every 3. But there are lots of ways of doing it. The problem isn't the mechanics, it's the vision. It's that we're still too willing to accept what we've got is the best we can do.
But do you see, can I just ask, do you see that as a biotechnology issue? Because corn subsidies existed before GM corn. I'm not sure that, I'm with you on corn subsidies, but I'm just curious whether it's for our GMO panel, whether it's a GMO issue or an industrial agriculture issue.
It's both, and it's both. We would have a problem with industrial ag without GMOs, but when you've got GMOs embedded into, and wrap their arms around the very heart of our industrial system, to think that you can talk about agriculture.
Did you say tentacles? That's what you meant.
Thank you. To think you can talk about one without the other. There's no way you can say, well, we're just going to talk about biotech over there, and then we're going to take on all these other products over here. These are integrated into our system. The farmers, the idea that farmers, what choices, I think we need to think about what choices farmers have. I'm not sure that, that they can responsibly, that it's a matter of individual farmers responsibly using Roundup Ready soybeans. When they're out there, they're being sold to everybody, pushed by every major, all the companies, all the land grants. That's all the kind of advice that you get. All the subsidies encourage you to do it. To say to put the onus on individual farmers to be responsible in the use of the technology, I don't think is right. I think we need, we have policymakers who do set the stage for agriculture and have set the stage for the agriculture we have right now. I'd rather rearrange that stage than blame the farmers.
Yes, I have to say it's the same thing with the consumer and food safety and meat. Well, if you'd only cook it till it was overdone, and if you'd only bleach your cutting boards, there'd be no problem. So it's up to the consumer, it's up to the farmer. So to feed the planet, and I definitely want to see smallholders and small-scale rotational farming.
And let's not talking about feeding the
Everywhere.
planet. Let's talking about helping the planet feed itself.
Great. So we will feed the planet, we will feed people, and we will feed the earth.